Hello, I'm Yolanda Chandler. I'm Postmasters DNP Cohort 2. This is NU 713 and the presentation is entitled Extreme Makeover. Please take a moment to review the table of contents. The purpose of this presentation is to identify a time when miscommunication occurred in my work environment and discuss variables that influence that occurrence. By the end of this presentation, the audience will achieve the following learning objectives: identify barriers to communication, know patterns of relating and patterns of meaning, discuss talking, listening, and mindfulness, explain the benefit of both and thinking, and recognize barriers to innovation. After graduating, I went to the intensive care unit. I worked night shift, and I was receiving report from the day shift nurse. A patient had just returned to the critical care unit following a left pneumonectomy. The nurse was giving me a report, and it happened to be the last patient that she was reporting on. As she gave report, she said, I think I've placed that patient on the wrong side. Well, as a new graduate, it was still fresh in my mind that at the time, the patient needed to be on their back, or on the other side. So the patient had a left pneumonectomy, so they needed to be on their left side. So she said, I think I've placed them on the wrong side. And I said, well, it's up with the good and down with the bad. So you have placed them wrong. I said, however, I'm going right now to the room. That'll be the first patient I see. So I went on to the patient's room. And when I enter the room, the surgeon's standing over the bed. He begins to yell at me and continued to yell for several minutes, both inside and outside the patient's room. So the patient's no longer sedated and they're hearing all this. So I go in, I'm trying to calm the surgeon. I'm repositioning the patient so that the lung that remains is up rather than down. I get the patient repositioned. The entire time he's yelling, this is nursing 101. He knows I'm a new graduate, so he assumes that I placed the patient in the incorrect position. So he rants, and I finally get him to come out of the patient's room, and he continues to yell. The nurse who had given me report, out the door she went to clock out. She didn't want to be the brunt of that, and she assumed I would throw her under the bus, which I did not. But he continued to yell, and he did so for a few minutes, and then he ran out of the unit. We had those double doors that we could exit from the nurse's lounge, but then also he went down the hall still yelling, came back in the doors, the locked doors, into the unit, and had another go at me before he was finished. The entire time I tried to communicate with the surgeon that I did know how to properly care for the patient, but he wouldn't calm down enough to hear anything that was said. Again, this was over 20 years ago. There was a very different culture than what we see today in most places. But it took a long time to earn that surgeon's trust after that misunderstanding. So what happened? Well, clearly there was an inaccurate nursing intervention passed from the recovery nurse to the ICU nurse. Neither nurse looked at the literature, and neither nurse felt comfortable asking the surgeon about positioning. The ICU nurse failed to confirm the information was correct when she was unsure. So just because the recovery nurse said it, she still did not confirm the correct position for the patient, resulting in the miscommunication with the surgeon. Receiving nurses' fear, so the ICU nurses' fear of an inability to communicate with the medical staff played a role here. And then my inability to communicate with the surgeon because his anger clouded the entire issue served as a communication barrier, resulting in a poor working relationship with that surgeon for several months after the incident. Conversation themes in that facility, and we still today have some of these issues in nursing, but they felt undervalued, particularly by the medical staff. Overworked, and that's nothing new in nursing, but the nurse said she couldn't break free to look for information on appropriate patient positioning, and she certainly could not communicate with the surgeon because there was no communicating with the surgeon. Had she asked, he would have belittled her, talked down to her. That was the culture at the time in that facility. So fear was a communication barrier as well. The nurses felt that they could not approach the doctors, and this isn't all, of course, but it was a large majority of the physicians there. So they felt that they could not communicate. There was a culture of blame. So nurses didn't report things. They didn't have those conversations that should have been taking place. So it was stagnant there. There could be no innovation in the workplace because there was no communication in the workplace. Nurses felt expendable, and physicians could be verbally abusive without reprimand, and this too was a conversation that was frequently heard in that facility. So, leadership for evidence-based innovation in nursing and health professions. It talks about patterns of relating and how people interact with one another. And the way that those interactions occur forms the organizational culture. And again, at that time period in that facility, it was not a good collaborative culture. So relational leading is discussed in the text, and it has an emphasis on collaboration, empowerment, dialogue, horizontal rather than lateral decision making, sharing, distribution, networking, and continuous learning and connectivity. Pretty much the polar opposite of what that facility was experiencing at that time. It refers to the ability of people in relationship to move with engagement and efficacy into the future. Individuals may be designated as leaders, but the process of leading is ultimately relational. So it's a group project, so to speak. It also talks about patterns of meaning. So there's specific themes in an organization, and these form a pattern of meaning that shape the organization with things such as a mission and vision statements. So ways of talking, listening, and mindfulness. Okay, the book talks about this as well. And with talking, every conversation is an opportunity to reinforce group values and norms and innovation and change. Conversations that clearly in my scenario were not taking place. The manner of speaking can reinforce or stabilize the culture. In other words, instead of, when we're having these conversations, of saying I or me, we need to say things like we and us. And then we need to use our language intentionally, think before we speak, in other words, and be authentic. And all that means is, be yourself when you're having these conversations. Don't try to be something you're not or bring something to the table that you don't feel authentic about. Say what you mean what you say. Okay, listening. Be present in the conversation, and that's something that I'm guilty of as well. I'll get distracted easily. Listen purposefully. In other words, don't interrupt. When you're the person that you're communicating with, the book is just saying, be there, be listening, clarify things you don't understand. Okay, and then monitor for those nonverbal cues, because we all know that nonverbal cues mean so much more than what's actually coming out of a person's mouth. So we have to really be present and watch for those nonverbal cues. And mindfulness. Be present moment to moment. Be aware of your surroundings and be aware of your behavior. Sometimes, we're the problem, and we need to be aware of that. And during all these conversations, of course, we don't need to be looking at the phone or doing anything on the computer. When we have interactions and conversations, we need to be present. The book talks about innovation. Deter from mechanistic planning. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Use both and thinking and encourage innovators. So breaking it down, that both and thinking enables innovation. The book talks about the both being recognized as the need and value of holding multiple perspectives as useful and viable. So in other words, it's not just what a physician thinks. It's not just what the nurse thinks. It's multiple perspectives that make things happen. The and is considered innovation in the text. The yet to be formed idea, process, or product that may emerge from these ongoing conversations. Say yes to the mess. This image actually came from the text, and I have to say this is what it feels like when I read the text. It's a lot of gibberish. This figure illustrates the messiness of healthcare organizations as conversations. Our initial reaction, based on our mechanistic and linear ways of thinking, is to simplify, control, and organize. And according to the text, if there's a simple answer to a complex problem, then it's probably the wrong answer. And I mentioned innovators in the last slide, and innovators have developed an ability to say yes to the mess and see the potential that emerges from all this. So how could I change the story? I could say the patient just returned to the critical care unit following a left pneumonectomy. The recovery nurse and ICU nurse reached out to the surgeon, searched the literature, and confirmed proper positioning. I received report and immediately assessed my environment while ensuring the patient was correctly positioned. The surgeon was standing over the patient when I entered the room and ensured that I had been educated properly on patient positioning. The receiving nurse, myself, and the surgeon worked collaboratively to ensure positive patient outcomes, and because of our common goal, the team worked to maintain effective, open lines of communication. In conclusion, to build a capacity for innovation, we must build and maintain trusting relationships, be curious, be vulnerable at times, which means stepping outside of our comfort zone or outside of our box, and we have to be able to have those honest conversations. Here are the references used for this presentation, and thank you for listening.